This episode is sponsored by Launch. Are you an insurance agent that is tired of quoting business to try and find a better premium to win new deals? Are you looking for a way to differentiate and stand out from your competition? Well, look no further than Launch. Launch is an industry-leading software platform that gives you pre-built assessments that you can walk through with your prospect. Launch automatically calculates your prospect's risk score, and this allows you to show your prospect the areas you can fix to negotiate better premium and coverage with underwriters. Offer more value to your clients, turn missed sales into closed business, and most of all, become a better advisor to your clients. Visit getlaunch.io today to get more information on how you can use Launch to win more BORs starting right now. That's getlaunch.io to learn more.
Welcome to the Getting Past the Premium podcast, where we focus on breaking down risk management problems bit by bit until we find a solution. If you would like to discuss anything you hear on GPP with us, please reach out using the links in the description. Enjoy today's episode.
All right, well, welcome to the show, Peter. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we a little bit of a scheduling switch up on a Friday morning, right? So I appreciate the flexibility. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. So this is going to be a fun conversation, like we were just talking. You've got a lot of different backgrounds and perspectives on the industry, and I think we can take this in a lot of different directions. But before we kind of jump in, do you want to give everybody that background and who you are, where you've been, what you're doing today, and then we'll dive in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think for context, I was an independent insurance agent for 7 years, working in a family agency, about 20 employees, out here in Cape Cod. Lobbied in DC with a big I 5 years in a row with young agents. So super familiar with the industry from an insider's perspective, truly believe in the independent agent part of the, supply chain. I don't think agents are going away. And I think when I was an agent, I was 23 and I was going up against, or I was selling to people who were 60, and I was trying to get them to fire their golfing buddy from 20 years. And I was just like, I just needed better tools 10 years ago. And I think that still is the case today. We see all these amazing tools everywhere else in our life. And then as agents, we're like back in the office behind a spreadsheet or behind some, clicks all over the place software with PDFs and different things. And it's just frustrating to think there's so much more we can be doing for our clients to get past the premium, right? And I knew there had to be a better, easier way. I had a chance to go to business school and a scholarship. And where originally I was planning on just kind of going to business school, learning more concepts on business, meeting more business owners, and just continuing to grow the family business. I ended up deciding very early on in the first few months, you know what, I'm going to dedicate my business school experience to building and launching a technology company, which is something I always wanted to do. I had to kind of step out from the wings of my dad's agency, so to speak, and go out on my own. And met my co-founder serendipitously on day one, and then launched Wunderite more or less in beginning of 2020. We raised our first friends and family money, and we've grown to about 30 people at Wunderite since then. So that's kind of a quick background on myself. At Wunderite, high level, we're building software for independent agencies to make it easier to fill out insurance applications.
Yeah, and if on that note, if anybody hasn't seen Wunderite, I'm sure because Peter's done a good job of getting it out in front of a lot of people. But if you haven't, it's a fantastic tool. Should certainly look into it. And I think we'll dive into that piece more specifically, Peter, and how it can support, the independent agent. But before we get to there, I know that, one of the things that I was really intrigued in having you on was some of the conversations you've been having with other folks around tips and tricks and things that you learned when you were selling insurance at the family insurance agency, and then I'm sure that some of those still apply in what you're doing today. But maybe let's talk through a couple of those, like some of your favorite ones that, you feel like would have been most impactful had I implemented, this when I was back selling.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we just came back from David Carruthers' Killing commercial retreat down in Key West. We had sponsored one of the fishing boats, caught a bunch of fish, had the freshest sushi in my life, which was an awesome experience.
Yeah, I'm really jealous of that, by the way.
Hey man, get on, be there next year. It was a fantastic time, great crew, and really just some organic energy that was out there. One of the things that came up with every agency that was there is they were talking about process. And I think it's so true. I think if you're going to build an amazing agency, you have to, build great processes that aren't necessarily like the most sophisticated things. They got to be kind of simple enough that anybody can kind of implement. So I talked about before, during, after. It's like, what can you do before a meeting, during a meeting, after a meeting? Kind of comes from like, if you're an airline pilot or just a pilot, you have to like, before we take off, here's the things you do. Like you make sure there's fuel in the tank, you make sure that things are working. And then before landing, it's like, hey, I make sure the landing gear can go down. And there's like a checklist you go through. And the same thing can really be implemented at your insurance agency. That's like the highest level. I actually wrote a blog post at Wunderite.com. Just hit the blog before, during, after. Jason Cass had shared a video on LinkedIn. I had a lot of people reaching out asking about it. So don't necessarily repeat myself in the before, during, after, but I think as far as a process to implement, that is one that's super simple. I think everybody can grasp it. It's basically like before you go to your meeting, like prepare for the meeting, during the meeting, execute the plan. And then after the meeting, like do good follow-up. That's kind of it in a nutshell. Have a few more tips I can dive into as well, but figured I'd start there.
Yeah. Cause that brings up something in my mind. Like when you say it like that, it's like, sounds super simple. Like, why doesn't everybody just do that? It's like, what was the conversation either down there that you've, had around this concept of people like, why can't we just build out the process that can, that solves for this?
I think
why it's so hard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious to get your guys' take, but I think, and listen, I've spoken to hundreds, if not thousands of agencies in my 11 years in the business. I've been to, different Marshberry events and Insight and Sitkins and Beyond Insurance and AI Branch, like Share and David Carruthers. So, and you read books like The Wedge. And so you hear these different methodologies that are out there. And I think, big picture, one of the learnings that I've taken away is some of the best and biggest agencies leadership come from the world of being a producer. True or false? What do you guys think?
I would agree with that. Yeah, I mean, you have a lot of learnings as being a producer that lend itself to that for sure. Ryan?
Yeah, I'm torn, like 50-50. I mean, I'll say no just because Elliot said yes.
Of course.
Fair enough. What I find is people who are really good at selling insurance and sell a lot of it tend to perform, like they become great performers. They become key players in an agency. And at some point, the agency is like, we got to keep this person around. There's a chance for that person to become a partner. The challenge is the same skill set that you have that makes an amazing salesperson doesn't necessarily translate into, I'm great at training everybody else to do like me.
Yeah.
And I think this isn't unique to salespeople, by the way. Like if you're a great software engineer, you might actually be better off like building great software as opposed to trying to lead a team, because leading a team, creating process, being a good people pleaser, people manager, it's just kind of a different skill set. And so I think back to your question, Elliot, like what kind of prompted this? I think a lot of agency owners that are building an agency from scratch themselves, just such a cool thing to see. And there's a lot of this happening across the country right now. There's so many agencies. I get fired up. We go to the IAOA events. And there's so many scratch agencies building something for themselves. And I love it. At some point, they're like, hey, it's me and I can get deals. I can close deals. I can do everything. Now I need to like get my staff to do it. And it's like, how do you get a self-motivated self-starter who built something from scratch and who's implementing or knows these processes from scratch, or it's their personality, it's their style. How do you get that to transfer to the rest of the organization? That's kind of, I think, the challenge. And so I think the before, during, after checklist is just like, hey guys, like, let's not overcomplicate it. Like just do these three basic things. And it's funny because I think one of the other great tips of all time, that I definitely appreciated. I don't know if you guys know the name Dan Sullivan with Strategic Coach.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds familiar.
Yeah. So Dan Sullivan, and this is actually another one of my tips. It's the 4 habits of referability. Have you guys heard of this before?
I have not.
All right, Ryan, let's go. What are the 4 habits of referability?
Putting you on the spot. Hey, get your Google fingers going real quick.
They're right.
So the 4 habits of referability, I say, also known as like, be someone that you want to do business with. How often have you called somebody like, because you're like excited about doing business with them? Like you're going to be you're going to pay them money and then they don't call you back, or they call you back a week later, or they call you back and they bungle the process. And at the end of it, you're just like, gosh, I actually don't like that person. I don't want to do business with them. I'm excited like to spend money on a kitchen addition, and now you're working with a contractor and it's just not a great experience. So 4 habits of referability, it's like be someone you want to do business with. And it's basically, it's so simple, but it's like why do we have to even train people on this? But it's basically show up on time, do what you say you're going to do, finish what you start, say please and thank you. Like, this is so basic. We shouldn't even have to be telling people it. But I think sometimes it's just a good reminder, like, oh yeah, like let's not overcomplicate this, right? You want to get past the premium. It's like start with by being someone that people want to do business with. Start by being a good relationship person. And like, what are the keys to that? It's like the habits of referability.
Yeah. So Elliot and I were just having this conversation, 2 days ago around exactly what you're talking about. How do we take skills from people who are doing it really, really well and transfer them to people who have no industry experience, we feel like have the right skill set to come in and do it, right? They've got kind of the right instincts, if you will. And our conversation was centered around how can we create just like guidelines or guardrails for these conversations, because we want to get to a point where they're replicating some of our tactics and conversations and how we communicate, how we can help clients and whatnot. But they almost have to make that all their own to be successful. Like they've got to come up with their own recipe. So how do we support through the right guardrails to allow them to like operate in this, channel that we know if you do these 3 or 4 things pretty well, you're going to have a good shot at being successful in that conversation or in that meeting or whatnot. So along the lines of what you were talking about, our thought process was just like, can we give them 3 or 4 things that they have to accomplish and then let them go try to figure that out on their own, right? And say like, come back to us understanding A, B, and C, and then we'll have that discussion. We'll figure out how you got there and what you did, and then we'll try to build on it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. I think it's like, what are some of the basics? And then people have to make it their own. I think this is so true. I think, in life, you see all these different coaches who, and so I think a lot of times, they're extreme advocates of themselves and their own coaching methodologies, but we all know that there's multiple ways to skin a cat, right? When I sold insurance, I used to do the gap analysis, and I was like, the reason I got a bunch of letters behind my name, I know like, you gentlemen have as well, was because I wanted to be the technician that could go into an account and speak almost academically and also experientially about why their insurance program is broken, like where the gaps were. That was kind of my way of doing the deal. But like, that's not the same that everybody doesn't have to be the gap analysis approach. Just like not everybody has to do the wedge approach. Like it's all kind of what's the right fit for you. And I think, if you have one agency whose niche is, let's say like lawyers and professional liability, and another producer whose niche is restaurants and entertainment, and another one who's manufacturing, or another one who has high tech, like it's a totally different approach. You can't take the same approach from a restaurant and an entertainment industry that you do like a professional law firm. It's just like a different feeling. It's different concerns. And so whatever that approach is, it's not necessarily always going to scale. So you definitely need people to, find in themselves, like who they, be true to yourself, right? Be true to that own self. And have that while, ideally you're probably having some of the things of, hey, before your meeting, during the meeting, after the meeting, what are the habits of referability? What are some of these basic things that just make a good quality salesperson that people like and want to do business with?
Yeah.
On a side note, what's your thought process around a niche? Do you find niches, or do you create niches, or do niches find you?
For every Starbucks in the US, there's 2.5 insurance agencies, independent insurance agencies. So I think the answer is yes, like it happens both ways. When you look at, if I can speak using my experience from Wunderite, one of the things that was really exciting to me about building a technology company like Wunderite was our niche, if you will, was extremely easy to define. It was independent insurance agencies who sell property and casualty insurance and do a good amount of commercial, probably have some excess and surplus. If you fall into that bucket, we should 100% be talking, right? If you're looking at A, B, C competitor, you owe it to yourself to take a look at Wunderite. That was like a super easy exercise. And I was really excited about that because back in my insurance days, it was like, we sell insurance to everybody, any state, any type of business, like whatever. I'm like a dog chasing cars. Like I will chase the car and take an opportunity at it.
Oh, yeah.
So I think the advantage of a niche finding you is you can kind of follow your creativity about like, what's an interesting account to me? Where do I naturally succeed at? I think that's one way of doing it. Another way could be more structured where you say, I see a gap in the market. Let's take example, cannabis insurance 10 years ago. Cannabis is going to become a thing. And I want to be the expert at that because I see a big market opening and I see a tremendous amount of growth. Or same with cyber. I think cyber is vastly undersold. You look at the guys from Evolve, they basically saw an enormous opportunity with growth. And so strategically you can say, I'm going to build a niche in this area. So I think like you can do it one of, multiple ways. My experience when I was an agent was I came into a family business. There were certain lines of business that we wrote. I think when I looked at it, I was kind of like, what are some of the biggest premiums that we write? What are the biggest revenue accounts? And then also in that subset, like people that I enjoy working with based on my renewal meetings, let me go target those accounts because historically, like we've done well on a couple of them. They're big dollar premiums. I like the relationships. I kind of knowing their industry language. Can we do more of that? So I think my feedback would be to your question is the answer is yes. It depends on the agency. If I was to go sell insurance today, I don't know. If I was to start from scratch today, I would probably take a more methodical approach where I would probably seek out where are the biggest opportunities? Who are the accounts that are being underserviced, undersold? Maybe they're disproportionately serviced by companies that recently went through an M&A process where they don't have the same producer account manager. Where are the markets where I know I can go crush it? Where are the accounts where I know I can go do a great job and there's tremendous growth opportunity? Like that's probably where I'd be targeting. Where are people not targeting today? And like, that's probably where I'd want to go target.
Totally. Yeah, no, I think the reason you asked that question, we go through this internally quite a bit when it comes to niches, and there is definitely both approaches that you can take. And so it's interesting, but the thing is you got to think about it, and that's where back to, I think one of your comments or questions earlier, or when I asked, like, why do people not do this? I think we battle that we have positives and negatives in our industry, right? Like we're independent agencies, so we've got all these different options and carrier contracts and things that we can bring to our clients. But that means that we can do a whole bunch of business out there that, we can do a contractor one day and a property manager the next and an optometrist the next. And, so it's a positive in that we have all these options, but it can be a negative where we never get real deep in one area, right? We never organically create that niche because we're working with so many different people. And then I do think the other thing, and this is where I'd be really curious your perspective, that we run into in our industry is we're still reliant upon the carrier. And so a lot of our business processes haven't evolved because there's still that element of once it gets the carrier involvement, we're semi-reliant on their process, right? And I know that, a great example of innovation in that space is Wunderite for a piece of that, right? Giving the agency more control over a piece of that process. But I know that you probably have thought about that quite a bit because I think that that's a big piece of this where, again, it's a positive and a negative, right? It's a way that somebody can get into our industry and get up and running pretty quick because at the end of the day, the carrier has their processes built. And if I gather this information, they're going to quote it and get it back to me and so on and so forth. But it can be a negative when you try to scale and you try to take these things and build your own processes that work for you because that's the thing. It has to work for you, not just, I can't take my processes at our firm and go and put it into your firm and they're going to work. You've got to make it your own. So what are your thoughts just around that whole commentary?
Yeah, look, I think I tell people, insurance it's a great industry to make a lot of money and to lose a lot of money. And I think one of the ways we've seen people making a lot of money is building literally multi-billion-dollar firms, simply by having an easier front-end experience, front-end quoting, front-end servicing. And like, that's really interesting to say. Our industry front-end experience is so bad that you can literally displace or compete with an incumbent just by having something that's a little bit easier on the front end. I think for economic reasons, we're going to continue to be fragmented. I think another thought I've had is, if I were to build an agency from scratch today, maybe I would be like, you know what, I'm just going to focus on this is something I have pipe dreams about, but it's like, let me just focus on a super low maintenance, like efficient, high profitability agency, 100% bootstrapped, that we only work with carriers that are really easy to work with, right? Because I remember the days of having, and look, if you're in a state where you do a lot of E&S, excess and surplus, like I'm from Cape Cod, like there's a lot of excess and surplus, so you just can't get around it. I think the industry is evolving, but I do think there's a space where you could say, I'm going to sell insurance in the United States. I'm only going to work with these 10 or 20 companies that can only sell insurance via API, totally automatically. Like, that's pretty interesting to me, because it's like, hey, this is like at least on the surface of it might seem like a high margin business, or like, hey, it's going to be not a ton of service work. There might be like some back end code that has to get written to make it all easy and intuitive, but ideally that code is scalable. That said, ultimately, and I think whether you're an individual producer or an agency, like ultimately at some point, it's like, if you're going to become big, then you're going to need to have multiple niches, most likely, or you're going to have to face the realities of a competitive market, which is people are always competing to make money. And so if you're going to do the best thing for your customers at some point, you might have to venture outside of the core thing that you do. You might have to go seek out a new carrier. Maybe that's also the challenge too, right? If you have a niche, or if you only work with certain carriers that are super easy to work with, what happens when they say, hey, we're pulling out of your state?
Yeah.
What happens when that segment of the industry tanks and you're like, I only do, I don't know. Let's say you do travel, right? And then COVID hits.
Yeah, I was going to say, it happened during COVID to several firms that I know. They were doing a bunch of restaurant business, and it just tanked, or trucking at that time, everything.
And it's also when the clients need you the most. Like they need you and they're calling you, and your hair's on fire. So, again, that's part of the beauty of having, in my opinion, a fragmented industry where you have lots of people who are trying to figure it out every day. Lots of smart, hardworking people like you guys, like my dad and his agency, trying to figure it out every day. And they're able to, through their strength in numbers, react more creatively to market challenges than being like, a huge conglomerate that owns the industry and, can't adapt quickly.
Yeah. Well, and that's the beauty of, sorry, Ryan, I'll let you jump in, but that's the beauty of where we're at, right? Is there are a lot of big conglomerates right now that are slow to move. And it is kind of fun to see the Carruthers of the world, and a lot of those nimble, smaller firms that are like, you know what, we're not scared of it. We're going to innovate it, and we're the ones that can move quick. And you better keep up, kind of thing. And it's fun to watch. So
it's the most, in my experience, it is the most exciting thing. And I think there's probably never been a better time to be like, I'm going to go build something. Anyway, it's a separate conversation, I suppose. But I know Ryan.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that sentiment. It's a amazing feeling to be in a blue ocean type environment, So there's a mindset shift that you have, when we're talking about niches or starting your own agency from scratch and only working with certain carriers and whatnot. Like, it's such a dramatic change from, we'll call it more of the traditional model, where people are like, their value proposition is centered around having multiple markets that you could go out, shop the product and whatnot. So I guess first, like, where do you think the industry's at in kind of shifting their value prop away from more of the traditional style, if you will. And next, like, do you feel like, I guess, what's the runway for people to continue to shift the mindset away from the traditional way of doing business?
What do you mean by the runway?
Like, you know, think that maybe on a percentage scale, you've got 30,000 independent agencies across the country. Like, how many of them have transitioned, and how many of them, just won't? Like, away from the traditional old school model. Like, how much opportunity sitting out there for a company like Wunderite to take a different approach that hasn't done it yet? That, like, they're 10 years out from shifting their mindset.
Yeah, so I think I remember someone told me 11 years ago, and I was just getting my start. I'm like, he was a super successful guy in real estate. I'm like, hey, what's the key to success in business? And he's like, again, he was probably 80 years old at that time. He's like, relationships. And I was kind of like, my mind, like, haha, old man, like, it's technology, it's not relationships. And 11 years later, I'm like, yeah, no, 100% it's relationships, right? It's not about the business, it's about the person. It's not about the rental property, it's about the person paying rent. It's not about, whatever factor, it's about the person who is providing the value behind it. And so I think the relationships are going to continue to remain more important than ever. So I think there is a certain amount of maybe the old way of, hey, I'm in my local chamber of commerce, I play golf, I play tennis, and like I have people that I just know and I can do business with them because I know them. Maybe that's not as important of like a way of sourcing deals, but I think the relationship aspect is still super important. Like if you're going to sell, for example, I don't know, insurance to the oil and gas industry, probably going to be good for you if you're out at all the oil and gas industry events and you know all the players in the space. You're not playing tennis with them necessarily. Maybe you're on the golf course as part of an oil and gas event, but you're there trying to move their industry forward. And so I just think it's a more focused mindset. And I think the technology is going to be, in a lot of ways, has to be supportive of that, where it's supportive of trying to help those relationships. So I think as far as mindset shifting, I think it's just the nature of, the way that technology has allowed us to kind of work from anywhere, not need an office. And there's a lot of things that have changed in the past 10, 15, 20 years because of technology. As far as the agencies, what percentage of agencies are transitioned, how many just won't? I'm probably not an authority on this, definitely not. But we have thought about it. Like, what percent of agencies every year are net new? What percentage of those agencies will be successful? It's a really interesting question. And I think what we've seen is, even with all the M&A activity, it's almost like for every agency that gets sold, like another agency gets created. And so I think there's certainly going to be a good set of agencies that sell naturally. And there's a question of how well will the acquiring companies integrate that company. And I know that some of the biggest challenges for agencies that I've talked to tends to be around like hiring great producers and then technology. And I think when you take acquisitions, there's probably big challenges around the technology at these firms, where all of a sudden, if you've acquired 100 or 200 agencies in the past couple of years, like take your headache at your agency, multiply that by 100 or 200, and try and integrate all these systems. And it's like, this is just super frustrating. So I think
talk about building process.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, and also in a world where, maybe the owner is not necessarily as motivated as they've been in the past because they've kind of got their payday. So I think there's going to be certainly a subset of agencies that won't change, they will sell. And we leave it to the acquirer to kind of figure out what kind of transition will happen. And then I think there's some agencies that are probably early in their kind of lives today, but are successful. They've probably already started to figure this out, right? Where they've already transitioned. And so those of us who maybe haven't, and we're asking the question, it's like, oh no, those agencies are out there and they're being successful and they're growing. Like I've met these agencies where they're growing very quickly because they've already transitioned to a new way of doing business. They've already found like a new thing where maybe they're at $1 million in revenue and hadn't even been around 2-3 years ago. And it's like that agency is growing tremendously quickly. And they're gonna be the agency that, you know, I'm gonna want to go work for. If I'm a producer, I want to go work for the growth agencies that are growing double digits year over year, have like the next generation culture, the next generation way of thinking about things. Yeah, and then I think if you're a scratch agency today, I think, and again, I'm not an authority on this, but I just would speculate that they're starting a business in a world where you can do business over Zoom, and like that's a criteria for success. And there's just the world is at your fingertips in your pocket with an iPhone. I think there will always be a place for traditional kind of brick and mortar locations, and you know, more traditional model. But I think we're seeing big shifts. We're seeing shifts even with like, you know, direct carriers wanting to, captive carriers wanting to go independent. It's just like consumers' mindsets are changing. So yeah, I think there's a good amount of agencies, to sum it up, that won't change. They'll sell. Those who are growing right now probably already have made some sort of a transition to like a newer way of doing things. And I think on the technology side, you know, technology is advancing, but it's there's no silver bullet, you know, just yet. You know, I don't think.
Well, there never will be, right? But somebody said this the other day, there's no silver bullet, but you should have a lot of bullets in your gun, right? And figure out how you can stack them to get the best result. And so, but one thing you said there that I want to go back to, you talked about relationships being the most, you know, important thing in business. Now you run a tech company. So how do you view so let me take a step back before I ask that. A lot of people view technology as removing that relationship, right? Because, oh, you want everybody to do everything online and through the technology, and then I have less touches. And, you know, now my like glove box, we were having this conversation with Andy, like, well, but I want my clients to call me because then I can talk to them. And it's like, no, like for certain things, but you don't want them calling for an auto ID card or whatever, you know? So how do you view technology in relation to the most important thing being relationships?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe that's a you know, a bit of a philosophical question. Like, hey, Peter, how can having a technological iPhone in front of you, where you're glued to the screen all day, make you better at relationships? And I've definitely noticed. You go to the airports, right? We were talking about this earlier on in the call. People, like everyone is glued. I'm glued to their phone. I remember, you know, 6 months ago when I was in Arizona, my co-founder and I and one of our sales guys was commenting how like it was just weird that you'd be like in a place with 100 people and they're just like literally every single one of them glued to their phone. Or you board the airplane, everyone's glued to their phone, and it's just a little weird. Like people used to have conversations.
Yeah,
they used to talk to each other.
Yeah,
you know, about the weather, about whatever. And now we just, you know, scrolling through TikTok like an addict. And it's, I mean, seriously, and it's kind of like it's, you know, it's concerning. When you think about the concentration of eyeballs on such, you know, so few algorithms deciding what we're going to think about world events. In any case, so what's the flip side? It's like, well, I can now connect with people on LinkedIn across the country. You can create a sub community focused on making XYZ better. Somebody at David Crothers' thing had commented, he's like, I think he said, someone had told me 10 years ago that in the future, you will have to fly across the country to be in one room with kind of your tribe, I think is what he had said. And like, I think that's a shift that's happened because we're able to have the technology that enables that. So I think my thesis has always been that technology is not really good or bad. It's kind of a tool, and how we implement it is good or bad. I think on the good side with relationships, you know, some of the stuff that, you know, like auto ID cards, certificates of insurance, like these weren't really relationship building things.
Yeah.
Right. And so anytime you have to do a non-relationship building thing, it's like, yeah, let's move to automate. But on the flip side, if it's like, if there is relationship building things, like then technology can also be used to make that better. So let's say you have a workers' comp process to, you know, lower someone's experience mod over time. The relationship part is important because the person's not really doing business with an algorithm. They're doing business with somebody who's like going to implement a tool or a process. Maybe it uses an algorithm that's going to help them over time. And they're going to, I don't know, talk to their employees, talk to their managers, and then they can leverage technology to help like implement the process. And so I think that, yeah, technology is an enabler in that sense, and it can help you focus more on the relationship because you don't have to spend as much time in the weeds of just like busy work. You know, if you don't have to spend your time sifting through hundreds of pages of policies because technology can help you with that work, you can have more time for actual risk management. You can have more time to like, yeah, go get lunch or dinner with your client and then talk about things and talk about the strategy and like, hey, here are the options. What do you want to do? I think if you look at technology, by the way, you know, we have to build relationships with people who want to write us a check to invest in us. And like, that's a huge thing, like building relationships. You have to build relationships with, you know, all sorts of people. And so I think, yeah, the relationship aspect, I think in my mind, it remains crucial. Certainly there's a change, right? And this is, I think going back 11 years ago that I was like, in the future, it's all going to be tech and it's all going to be the algorithm. But I think maybe technology just makes some of the more mundane stuff a little bit easier and can, if for those of us who use it well, allow us to have more meaningful connections.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I think that's very well said. And I think why that's scary for a lot of people is like, you know, when you think about traditional insurance agents, like that was the value prop of many insurance agents. It still is. And it's not a bad thing. We're like, hey, we answer on the first call, you know, we get back to you ASAP. We get your certificates out in 24 hours. And things like that, you know, 10, 20, 30 years ago were a big deal because you had to have good people that could do all those things and so on and so forth. But to your point, and you phrased it really well, in that it's not necessarily about taking technology to replace you as a human. It's redesigning what your value to the client's going to be. You know, if you think about Wunderite, and I'm going to take a very small piece of it, right? But you make it really simple to gather all the information for insurance applications and everything you need to get a submission in, right? Well, let's say that I'm going to spend an hour, 2 hours going through that with the client in the old model. Well, yeah, that's an hour, 2 hours I'm spending with the client. But what if I could make that a 15-minute process, and then I could spend an hour talking to them about, okay, hey, why are your deductibles set up the way they are? You know, I noticed this on one of your vehicles. Like, talk to me about that. How are you handling that? Like, before I get this all sent in, I want to make sure everything's right for you. And you know what I mean? Like, you can just change that whole conversation and where you're spending your time. But if I have 2 hours with the client where I'm just gathering information, you know, nobody's going to want to spend another hour talking about that. You know?
Well, let me take it a step further, right? Like, haven't you had this conversation last year and the year before and the year before?
Yeah.
And all you did is you scanned in the Hartford app into your agency management software, you send it off to the underwriters, and you never use that again. And so they're like, why were you doing the same questions every year, guys? Whereas if you can go back and say, hey, Elliot, I know last year, you know, last 5 years, revenue was trending up about 10% a year. Last year, you're at 5 million in revenue. Payroll was this. How has it changed since then? And you have those conversations. Hey, by the way, you know, Elliot, last year you said you didn't have, you know, multi-factor authentication for the employees. You didn't have XYZ. We actually identified an opportunity to implement, you know, risk management procedures that can drive your costs down. You know, over time. Like every insurance application you've ever filled out has hundreds of data points. Each data point is literally the prescription to risk management solutions. They're just sitting there in a flattened PDF in your AMS. And so I think that's where, like, if technology can help and say, actually, what if every time we ask a question, like with a Wunderite, that's now a data point, an individual data point that you could then use to make recommendations, prescribe solutions, whether it's insurance policies, whether it's risk management, whether it's contracts. You know, if somebody told you 2 years ago, they haven't updated their roof in 20 years. It's like, well, gosh, on your annual conversations, you might say, hey, Elliot, a couple things that we flagged from last year. Your guys' properties are getting kind of old and there's a hardening market coming. Lumber prices are up, et cetera. You know, you can't hire a general contractor. You guys should strategically, when you're thinking about dollar allocation, I think like grounds repairs is probably a category you guys should strategically plan on addressing so that we can make sure your insurance is marketable in the future. Or, hey, we recognize that, you didn't have employment practices liability insurance, right? Which I don't recommend you use that term, but there's no EPLI in place. In fact, you don't have it like this in your handbook at all. There's no sexual harassment stuff. There's none of this, there's none of that. We should start thinking about this thing, whether you buy insurance or not. Let's start thinking about how are you addressing this at your company. And again, you're leveraging like what was before just a data gathering tool, and now this is like a prescriptive tool. And I think that's part of what I see as part of the value of a tool like Wunderite is, longer term, the ability to take meaning out of the data just beyond, can we get you an insurance quote somewhere?
Yeah, and this is probably a rabbit hole that we could spend a whole nother episode talking about, so maybe we will. But the way that you phrase that is like, so we were just talking to a CFO too, and he's like, we're talking about systems and things, and he's like, well, you either use your system to do it or you use brute force, but you need the information either way. So brute force being, people, effort, we got to get the information somehow. So like what you were describing on the personal lines examples, like you could go back and look at your past notes and look at your past information in your system, spend the time analyzing it, and you could get that information to make the recommendation to the client. There's nothing wrong with that. But what if you had a tool that looked for that information for you, presented that to you so that you could look at, all of those data points that you talked about, and then take that to the client and have that robust conversation. So what you're removing is that back end work on your plate to have to go and find that same information when the system's just got it there for you. And then you can go and make the recommendation to the client. So again, it's just an example of you could do it either way. Technology can help enable you to do it in a quicker, easier fashion so that you can spend more time discussing that with the client, less effort to get there, if that makes sense.
Hey, look, if anybody has a car that has told you that your car is about to run out of gas, would you like me to find the nearest gas station? Like that's moving from data on a screen, which is like how much gas is in your tank, to recommendation, right? Like what should you do with that information? And like, let me prescribe a potential solution. So I think like people are getting more and more used to this, where it's, maybe you've used Google Maps and it's like, you get directions to some place and it's like, hey, this restaurant won't be open by the time you arrive.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like moving from data to actionable info. And I think the insurance industry is going to be doing the same thing, where it's moving from data on an app to like, hey, what can you actually do? I can guarantee if you haven't encountered this yet, you probably will, where your cyber carriers are going to start having bigger applications, and they're going to start saying, hey, look, if you don't have multi-factor authentication, if you don't have, firewall, if you don't have whatever, like you're not getting insurance. Just like 10, 20 years ago, it's like, hey, if you don't have an up-to-date roof in a wind-prone state, you're not getting property insurance, right? It's the same thing. If you don't have flood techniques on the building, you're not going to get flood insurance. And it's like, that's what's going to happen.
It's already happening. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So yeah. Look, the other thing that I could have talked about, I don't know if we have time for it today, but talking again, you probably hit up on one or two of the tips. One of the tips that I'm actually writing a little bit of a book, and I think one of the ones I start with is talk dirty. And so I think talk dirty is going from, and I only mentioned this because I mentioned employment practice liability insurance, right? And you talk to the average customer, business owner about like employment practice liability insurance, their eyes roll back in their head, and they're like, I don't know what this means. I think even if you ask the average producer, what is employment practice liability insurance, they probably struggle to give you a coherent, concise answer, right? And I think that's just part of our industry, is we are so stuck in our lexicon of terms that no one understands. We feel comfortable when we can say EPL, right, or BII or whatever, and it's like cut the language that no one understands. Words like claim, or loss. There's so many terms we have, like disability or co-insurance, which again, no one can probably explain concisely the formula. I know you guys can because you're really smart. But the average
giving Ryan a lot of credit here.
But I think like, you gotta, depending on your target audience, you don't want to overdo it, but it's like remove those words. It's not a claim. It's, hey, when your guy, is working and the shelf falls off the wall and breaks his back and he can't go to work for 6 weeks, and he's out of job for 6 weeks. It's when he can't work for the rest of his life, who's going to cover his expenses? Who's going to pay his mortgage, right? And you start to reframe it in a way that people understand. It's not EPL. It's, hey, when that guy that you hired says something really dumb to the gal at the front desk, how is your insurance policy going to respond? Or it's not umbrella. It's when someone on your company like crashes a car in a really bad way, and really screws up, takes somebody out, permanent disability, like how much money do you want the insurance company to be on the hook for? And so I think like one of the tips I think that we can use at our company is if you understand these complex things that we have a special lexicon for in the insurance business, how do we simplify that and make it more vivid for our prospects so they can, make an easier judgment call on whether or not they should buy the product.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And again, you're probably right. That's a whole nother. We've got, I think, another few episodes lined up, Peter. So I hope your schedule's free because we got a few extras. But no, I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. I mean, that we covered a lot of ground. That was fun.
For sure.
If again, folks haven't reached out and learned about Wunderite, reach out to Peter or their team. They got a lot of awesome folks on their team, and it's a cool product. You should definitely learn about it, know that it's out there, research it. And other than that, Peter, we will catch you on the next one.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Pleasure to see you guys again.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.
Likewise.
Thank you for tuning in to Getting Past the Premium. We are excited to continue breaking down barriers and finding solutions together. If you would like to reach out regarding anything you heard in today's episode, find links and contact info in the description. Until next time, have a great day, and let's continue getting past the premium.